We're going to cross down to Canberra, catch up with Queensland Senator Amanda Stoker, who's just ducked out of a committee hearing she's been involved in. Thanks for joining us, Senator. First up, let me get you on this strategic discussion we're having at the moment. Your colleague Andrew Hastie has started this with what I thought was a very well-reasoned and timely op-ed, yet he's had some cabinet ministers, no less, slap him down.
Look, I think Andrew Hastie is very well informed on these matters. He's got a lot of life experience from his time in service, but he's also chair of a committee that often deals with the strategic implications of these relationships. And what he said in essence was really quite sensible, and that is that we need to be thinking about the way that Australia relates to China and the different way that China sees itself in the world. And one example I'll use is that, oftentimes Australians think about defence and government and commercial interests as being well and truly separate, whereas oftentimes the Chinese approach is to blend two or more of those categories. And so unless we understand the goals of China, unless we understand the way they approach commerce and defence and government, and unless we make an effort to appreciate the way they're going to go about achieving those goals in the long term, then we're not going to be in a position to put ourselves in the best place going forward.
And we have to understand that they approach all of those issues from a communist standpoint, from a Maoist standpoint.
That's right, and so we can't assume that the values that are really important to us are going to be the same ones that are motivating Chinese action.
So what does it say about our values then when a trade minister effectively slaps down a backbencher for talking about these important issues and says that we shouldn't say anything that will damage our national interest, i.e. we shouldn't say anything that might ruffle a few feathers in Beijing?
Well, I can understand why Senator Birmingham's got a real interest around the trade perspective, because that's an important focus for him. But Mr Hastie's looking at it from a different perspective, and they are both important. So let's take all of those views, put them on the table and find a path forward for the future that takes into account all those considerations.
Is there an issue here with the coalition government just months after the election where it's not engaging in these serious debates willingly enough? There's an attempt to shut down a debate on China and our strategic outlook. There's an attempt to shut down a debate on the superannuation guarantee, for instance, which Peter Costello says is a debate we very much must be having.
Look, there's always a tension between the need to be working as a team, working together, being all on the same page, and the ability of people to bring their unique skills and interests and perspectives to the table. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with people expressing a view from time to time about the things that they think are important to them, and obviously Mr Hastie's done that in relation to China, and feeding those things into the work of the team. I think that's constructive, and I don't think that's inconsistent with a government that is moving ahead in the national interest.
Indeed, this is the essence of parliamentary democracy, isn't it? You're a backbencher. If backbenchers just shut up and only let the executive do the talking, how do you get any policy development? Surely you should be encouraged to have sensible, constructive debate on the issues that are confronting the nation.
Yeah, I've got a strong view that that's core to the job of a backbencher, to be listening to their constituents, to be formulating policy that reflects those concerns, and to be bringing it to the executive for action and trying to help make the case for that action as part of a wider debate.
And to that end, you're now working with a number of other backbenchers to push industrial relations reform. What do you want to achieve there? Look,
I've always been passionate about the ways that we can get our economy as productive as it can be. And productivity is not a term that's well understood, but of course it's all about making sure that we are creating as many jobs as we possibly can, having wages rise at a time when they should be rising, and also making sure that we're producing goods and services as cheaply as possible for consumers. These are all things that are good for workers. And so I think there's a job for the backbench, but for the whole team, to make the case that says improving in small and practical but significant ways, the way we do industrial relations, can deliver real benefits for working people who are currently struggling with the cost of living. So there's things that we can do, some of which I floated at the CPAC conference at the weekend to try and make a difference here. They include everything from pushing ahead with the government's Ensuring Integrity Bill to make sure that we don't have recidivist offenders running unions and operating slush funds in their own interests rather than in members' interests. But it also involves, I think, being practical about the burden that exists on small business from unfair dismissal laws and some of the impracticalities that come with the complexity of modern awards, and also the impracticality that comes from not making EBAs run for the entirety of construction and other major projects. It doesn't make sense to have a renegotiation midway through in circumstances when you could be doing these things from the outset, budgeting for the whole project, having certainty, and of course making sure that the union doesn't hold a gun to everybody's head halfway through the project by being unreasonable in a subsequent EBA negotiation. So there's lots of practical, simple things we can do, but the guts of it is good for working people. And so I want to be a part of making that case.
So industrial relations can be a pretty volatile area politically, pretty dangerous for the coalition. Everyone's a little bit gun-shy after work choices. Are you getting any pushback from the IR Minister, Michaelia Cash, or from the Prime Minister to stop this debate, not have it in public, just work through coalition committees, backbench committees through the party room?
Look, I won't reveal any sort of private conversations, but I'm very happy to work through our backbench committee process. It's really constructive, and of course I'm chair of the one that looks after industrial relations, so of course I've got a great opportunity there. But that doesn't mean we can't be making the case in the community for why these things matter, because even if we can get policy through our internal processes, that doesn't obviate the need to get out amongst our constituents and explain why this matters to people. It's a big part of putting the case for reform.
Well, that's why governments shouldn't shut down debate, because whatever reform you end up settling on, the public needs to be part of the conversation as to why some sort of reform is necessary. It even applies, of course, to the China debate. You can't just pretend there's not an issue there and then, as a government, do things to address that issue, whether it's blocking Huawei from the NBN or some other military spending, as we're seeing today, boost our spending with the SAS. I mean, all these things are linked. Surely the public are right to expect government MPs, even backbenchers, even lowly backbenchers, are entitled to discuss these things.
Look, I think it's important for bringing people with you, and from the perspective of a backbencher, it's important to doing your job properly. So I'm going to keep doing it. Good
on you. Good for you. And we'll see whether anyone tries to slap you down. Although you won't tell us. We'll just see whether you turn up and talk anymore. Now, tell me about, when you talked about industrial relations, you talk about the benefit for workers, the need to increase jobs and increase wages. I just saw Ed Husic, Labor MP, now backbencher Ed Husic, speaking on Sky earlier today. I caught up with him for a chat afterwards. And what he's talking about here, I would have thought, is an issue that both sides of politics need to recognise. Now, you might have a different prescription to what Ed Husic and Labor's unionist members would have. But surely you must be worried. We must be all worried that it's a long time now since the GFC. Companies have returned to profitability. Unemployment is relatively low for the modern age, yet we're still not getting wages growth. There must be something governments can do. There must be all sorts of soul-searching about what policy options can be undertaken to try and encourage wages growth.
Look, I haven't heard what Mr Husic said, but if what he's saying is that we need to take action to try and facilitate wages growth, then, look, I would agree with him on that. But the changes we can make to improve Australia's productivity are the key to that. The answer isn't a Labor-style re-regulation of labour, which would only stifle the economy and end jobs, particularly for people who are on the margins of the employment market in our community. What we need to do is make all businesses more productive so that they can take on more people, so that they have the capacity to pay them more. That's how we get more bang for our buck that flows on to working people. And this has been a problem throughout the developed world. It's not unique to Australia, but that's not an excuse. We still need to be doing what's necessary to shift this phenomenon.
Yeah, there's no doubt this is a problem economists and policymakers are grappling with in Europe and in the US and elsewhere. Is it just a matter of increasing economic growth? Is that the trouble, that economic growth has been so sluggish? Or is there a fear that technology is catching up with us and businesses are actually investing more in boosting their productivity through technology rather than through looking after their workers?
Look, I think there has been an investment in technology, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Technology change and technology investment doesn't have to be inconsistent with ongoing employment for working people, and it doesn't have to be inconsistent with rising wages. But I do think it means that it's untenable for us to ignore one significant part of the puzzle, and that is dealing with industrial relations. And, our side has been a little tentative in that field, given what happened in 2007. But I think there is a real case to be made for us to do simple, practical, pro-working people changes that will have that effect. And there's plenty we could work with.
Now, Senator Stoker, what you've been focused on today in committee work is these new laws proposed to tackle some of the protesters who've been marching onto farms and agricultural businesses, some new federal laws, using telecommunications power to try and make sure you can clamp down very strongly on people organising these protests. Do you think you're going to get bipartisan support for these laws?
Look, I'm not sure. I know that there's been some questions from Labor and the Greens about this. Obviously, the Greens are going to outright oppose it. The Labor questioning's been, I guess, a little bit more tentative. But there's no doubt that we've got a strong message from our agricultural community that they are intimidated and concerned by the fact that they are living in their businesses, because most farmers live on the properties where they work, and they are living in places that are quite remote to help. So when a herd of noisy, naughty activists rock up on their property and often without them even knowing that it's occurring, enter the premises, start stirring up the animals and interfering with animal welfare so that it looks bad on camera, then we've got a situation where animal welfare is being harmed, where individuals and their families who are running businesses are being frightened and intimidated, and their property rights are being violated in a way that they can't easily remedy because they are so far away from help. So what we're trying to do here in the Parliament today is get through the Legislation Committee a bill that would make it a crime to use a carriage service, use the internet or a telephone to essentially incite people to rock up on farms and trespass. It's something that's already contrary to law, but obviously isn't being effective in the way that state and territory governments are enforcing it. And so we've got to find other ways that we can make sure that we can keep farming families safe and also keep activists safe, because they're not safe when they're running around causing damage and trouble on other people's properties. Yeah, perish the thought that some feral protesters should accidentally end up on an electric fence and get a bit of a shock or something. Just the mind boggles. Look, Amanda Stoker, while I've got you there, you were at the CPAC conference over the weekend. Could you briefly give me a summary of the gun-toting, hateful white supremacy that you encountered? I didn't see any of it, I can tell you that. I was there on the Friday, and I can tell you that everyone who was an attendee was well behaved, really interested in the policies that were being discussed, and they covered everything from, how do we cultivate a society that values free speech, through to productivity that I was talking about. We had all kinds of interesting discussion. None of it was extremist, in my view. And while there was a whole weekend's worth of activities, all you had was a group of people genuinely interested in tossing around ideas that could help build a better country. And quite frankly, that's something we should be encouraging all Australians to get involved in. It was a really positive event, and one that I hope will continue. Yeah, I wasn't there, but I noticed some friends of mine who are Indigenous and another who's of Bangladeshi origin. Oh, yeah. They were there. A strange group to be white supremacists. Well, Jacinta Price gave an outstanding talk about the ways that we can advance the interests of Indigenous people. We covered that in a way that, you wouldn't have thought that a bunch of white supremacists would be super interested in. And, of course, that's because they aren't white supremacists. I mean, the use of the word alt-right to describe this group is really quite defamatory. I mean, that is quite quite an unfair way to characterise this group. These are mainstream centre-right people who share the values of the vast majority of white Australians, and wonderfully for our country, they're prepared to do some work to try and advance some ideas. It's good.
Well, this is what the left are trying to do, to shut down their political opponents. Anybody who is right of centre these days is called hard right or alt-right, or even, you know, even more volatile terms. It's ludicrous. And it's a worry because it's so divisive, right?
It is really divisive, and if you were to take the prescription that Christina Keneally put out for our country to its logical end, it would mean that you never spoke to anybody unless you'd pre-vetted their ideas and checked that you agreed with all of them before you even spoke to them, before you entered the room, which means you'd only ever be interacting with people you already agree with. That's a recipe for a divided country. It's a recipe for people who can't engage with and speak to people from different backgrounds. It's really unhealthy, and as politicians we need to be engaging with and talking to people from all walks of life and all different belief systems all the time to be doing our job properly. All that tells me is that I'm doing my job properly and she's not.
Well said, Senator. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Chris.